What does it take for a woman devoted to a god to suddenly become the city's greatest threat? Inside the great temples dedicated to Baal, a single accusation could transform a sacred life into a condemned existence. This was not about crime in the modern sense. It was about transgression against invisible laws, whispered rules, and unspoken fears that governed religious power in ancient cities. In Baal's temples, every movement of a woman connected to the cult was watched, interpreted, and judged. A misplaced word during a ritual, a refusal to obey an order, a perceived impurity of body or thought, or even attracting too much reverence from the people could trigger suspicion. These women were labeled sacred offenders, not because they harmed others, but because they disrupted the fragile balance of authority inside the temple walls. The term itself carried terror. A sacred offender was believed to threaten the favor of the god, endanger harvests, provoke drought, or invite military defeat. Fear became the most powerful weapon. Once suspicion took root, logic disappeared. The accusation alone was enough to isolate a woman from her peers, strip her of protection, and prepare the ground for punishment disguised as divine necessity. Temple guardians were not merely protectors of stone and ritual objects. They were enforcers of obedience, trained to believe that mercy was weakness and doubt was heresy. Their loyalty was not to the woman standing before them, but to the structure of power that sustained the cult. To question an accusation was to question the god himself, and that was unthinkable. What made these accusations especially dangerous was their secrecy. There were no public trials, no formal defenses. Decisions were made in inner chambers, behind closed doors, heavy with incense and authority. The city outside continued its routines, unaware that within the sacred complex, lives were being dismantled in silence. These women were not outsiders. They were initiates, servants, guardians, voices of prayer. Their fall served a purpose beyond punishment. It reinforced fear. It reminded everyone that devotion offered no safety once power felt threatened. In a society where religion and governance were inseparable, control of women's bodies, voices, and spiritual influence became a strategy of survival for those at the top. And this raises a disturbing question that the city never wanted asked. If these women were chosen by the god, how could they so easily become enemies of the divine? The answer lies not in theology, but in human ambition, insecurity, and the ruthless mechanics of sacred authority. Because once a woman crossed that invisible line, the temple no longer saw her as sacred. It saw her as expendable. And what happened next was carefully hidden from the streets beyond the walls. If this hidden reality inside Baal's temples unsettled you, that reaction matters. These stories were buried precisely because understanding them threatens the myths we inherit about power, faith, and history. When you engage with this content, you help bring visibility to voices that were erased and force uncomfortable questions back into the light. Leave a comment sharing what shocked you most or what questions this raised for you. Your perspective adds to the conversation and keeps these histories from being silenced again. If this kind of raw, researched storytelling is important to you, leave a like so more people can find it, and subscribe to the channel to follow the full unraveling of what ancient cities tried so hard to hide. Who decided when protection became punishment? Inside Baal's temples, the guardians occupied a position that was both revered and feared. Officially, they were the shields of the sacred, entrusted with preserving ritual purity, enforcing divine law, and protecting the god's presence from contamination. In reality, they operated along an invisible line where devotion slowly transformed into sanctioned violence. These guardians were not random enforcers. They were selected, trained, and conditioned within a closed religious hierarchy. From the beginning, they were taught that hesitation endangered the city, that doubt offended the god, and that compassion could invite catastrophe. Every famine, every military loss, every unexplained illness was framed as proof that impurity had been allowed to exist too long. Fear was not a side effect of their authority. It was the foundation of it. Once a woman was labeled a sacred offender, the guardian's role shifted instantly. She was no longer a person within the temple order. She became a problem to be neutralized. Language changed first. Names disappeared, replaced by labels associated with contamination and threat. This linguistic erasure made the next steps easier. Violence feels justified when the victim is no longer seen as human, but as a risk to the divine order. The guardians enforced separation before. Punishment. Isolation chambers, restricted zones, sealed inner rooms were used to remove the accused from all social contact. This was not merely containment, it was psychological disintegration. Cut off from rituals, from witnesses, from the rhythms of daily devotion, the woman's identity collapsed. By the time punishment began, resistance had already been broken. What makes this system especially disturbing is how methodical it was. Ritual gestures accompanied acts of cruelty. Incense was burned while restraints were applied. Prayers were recited while bodies weakened from deprivation. Every violent act was wrapped in symbolism, giving the illusion that the god demanded it. Responsibility dissolved upward into the divine, while accountability vanished entirely. The city outside the temple walls rarely questioned these actions. The guardians were visible figures of authority, moving through streets during festivals, honored in processions, respected by families who believed their power kept chaos at bay. This public image made the private horror untouchable. To accuse a guardian was to accuse the god, the priesthood, and the city's survival itself. And here lies the critical fracture. Protection was never meant to destroy those it claimed to defend. Yet inside Baal's temples, guardians crossed that line repeatedly, convinced that violence was not only permissible, but necessary. Once that belief took hold, there was no clear boundary left, only escalation. Because if ritual violence could be justified once, it could always be justified again. And the next step pushed the system further into darkness, where accusation alone was enough to seal a woman's fate. How does a charge exist before evidence ever appears? Inside Baal's temple complex, accusations did not emerge from investigation or testimony. They emerged from interpretation. Dreams reported by priests, omens read from smoke and animal entrails, shifts in ritual outcomes, or rumors whispered among attendants could all be transformed into proof of spiritual betrayal. Once framed as divine signals, these interpretations were treated as facts. Impurity was not a fixed concept, it was deliberately vague. A woman could be accused for menstruating at the wrong time, for showing signs of exhaustion during ritual service, for questioning a sequence of chants, or for attracting attention that challenged male authority within the cult. Blasphemy did not require spoken rebellion. Silence, hesitation, or emotional withdrawal could be reclassified as resistance to the god's will. What made these accusations lethal was their elasticity. Because the rules were unwritten and constantly shifting, no woman could fully protect herself. Compliance offered no safety. Devotion offered no shield. In fact, the more spiritually visible a woman became, the greater the risk she posed to the hierarchy. Influence was interpreted as ambition. Reverence from others became suspicion. Respect turned into threat. Once an accusation surfaced, it moved rapidly through a closed internal process. Senior priests consulted guardians, scribes recorded symbolic signs, and ritual specialists confirmed interpretations that aligned with institutional interests. There was no adversarial structure. No one was tasked with disproving the charge. The system existed solely to validate it. Sentences were decided before confrontation. The accused was summoned not to defend herself, but to submit. Questions were rhetorical, framed to elicit confession or compliance. Any attempt to explain was read as defiance. Any emotional response became evidence of guilt. Silence was interpreted as acknowledgement. There was no correct answer, only acceptable surrender. This process served a dual purpose. It punished the individual and reaffirmed the authority of the institution. Each accusation reinforced the idea that the temple alone could interpret divine will. By controlling meaning itself, the clergy eliminated the possibility of dissent without ever naming it as such. Outside the temple, these mechanisms were invisible. The city heard only fragments. A woman had offended the god. The god demanded correction. The temple acted. This narrative protected the institution while erasing the complexity and brutality of what occurred inside. And so, punishment became inevitable long before any ritual began. Guilt was assumed, constructed, and sealed through belief systems designed to prevent contradiction. The next phase did not require justification anymore. It required execution of a decision already made. What happens to a woman once the sentence exists, but no one is meant to witness it? Inside Baal's temple, punishment rarely took the form of immediate execution. Instead, it unfolded slowly, deliberately, through methods designed to break the body without leaving obvious marks and to erase the person without public spectacle. Confinement was the first stage. The accused was removed from all ceremonial spaces and placed in sealed inner chambers reserved for what the clergy called correction. These were narrow rooms with limited light, poor ventilation, and no contact with the outside world. Isolation was not temporary. It could last days or weeks, long enough to dissolve any remaining sense of identity. Time lost meaning. Ritual bells and chants continued elsewhere, reminding the confined woman that devotion persisted without her. Food deprivation followed. Starvation was framed as purification. Portions were reduced to symbolic offerings, sometimes nothing more than water mixed with ash or salt. Weakness was interpreted as submission. Collapse was taken as proof that the god was satisfied. The body became a measuring instrument for obedience. When strength failed, the system considered it progress. Ritual erasure accompanied physical decline. Personal items were removed. Names were no longer spoken. In some cases, scribes amended temple lists, marking the woman as withdrawn or unworthy of mention. This administrative disappearance mattered as much as the physical punishment. To be erased from record was to be erased from memory. It ensured that even survival would not restore status or voice. What makes this stage especially disturbing is its intentional invisibility. No screams echoed through the streets. No execution scaffold stood in the public square. The city remained calm. Families continued to bring offerings. Festivals proceeded. Horror was contained behind walls thick enough to protect the institution from scrutiny. These punishments served more than discipline. They were instructional. The suffering of one woman was meant to be imagined by many. Rumors circulated without details, amplified by fear. Everyone understood the message. Disobedience did not end quickly. It dissolved you slowly, quietly, until nothing remained that could challenge authority. And when the body finally gave out, or the mind fractured, beyond repair, the temple had options. Some women were declared spiritually dead. Others were transferred to hidden burial rites. A few were released into society stripped of identity, broken, and silenced. In all cases, the narrative remained controlled. If this hidden system of punishment unsettles you, leave a comment with the word erased so this silence does not repeat itself. When suffering was framed as sacred duty, the body became the altar. Inside Baal's temple, physical punishment was rarely described as violence. It was called correction, alignment, or offering. These words mattered because they transformed coercion into obligation and pain into proof of faith. Once a woman crossed into the category of sacred offender, her body was no longer her own. It belonged to the ritual logic of the institution. Punishments were calibrated, not chaotic. Guardians and ritual specialists understood exactly how much pain could be inflicted without provoking immediate death or visible scandal. Binding positions restricted circulation and breathing under the guise of posture discipline. Exposure to cold stone floors during night vigils weakened muscles and joints. Repetitive physical tasks were imposed until collapse, then resumed after partial recovery. Each act was justified as necessary to cleanse spiritual contamination. Sexual control formed a darker layer of this system. While rarely recorded, coercive rituals targeting the body were embedded in ideas of purification and submission. The language of devotion masked exploitation. Consent was irrelevant because refusal itself was interpreted as further evidence of guilt. In this way, violence was not only permitted, but demanded by the narrative of divine appeasement. The psychological impact was inseparable from the physical. Pain was synchronized with prayer. Endurance was demanded during invocations that framed suffering as meaningful. Over time, this produced dissociation. When the body hurt enough, resistance dissolved. The system did not need chains forever. The internalization of obedience did the work. What makes this stage especially chilling is how it blurred boundaries. Outsiders might have interpreted fragments of these rituals as extreme piety. Even some participants convinced themselves that what they were witnessing was sacred necessity. This ambiguity protected the institution. Violence hides best when it looks like devotion. The city rarely questioned these practices because results were visible. The accused emerged weaker, quieter, obedient, or not at all. Order appeared restored. Fear remained intact, and the lesson was absorbed without explanation. Holiness was dangerous. Authority was absolute. The body was expendable. Yet beneath the ritual language, the truth remains stark. These acts were not about gods. They were about control. Control over flesh, over voice, over the possibility that a woman's spiritual presence might rival institutional power. By reducing the body to an instrument of atonement, The temple ensured that punishment would feel inevitable, even deserved. How does an entire city learn to look away while horror unfolds at its sacred center? Silence inside Baal's temple was not accidental. It was engineered, reinforced, and maintained through a system that extended far beyond the inner chambers. What happened to sacred offenders depended not only on priests and guardians, but on a population conditioned to accept absence without askings. Why? Information control began with language. Women who vanished were said to be withdrawn for extended purification, reassigned to distant sanctuaries, or taken under special divine correction. These phrases sounded temporary, procedural, and holy. They discouraged curiosity. Anyone who pressed for details risked being associated with impurity themselves. Questions became dangerous, not because of answers, but because of who might be listening. Ritual calendars played a role. Major festivals followed periods of punishment, not by coincidence, but by design. Public celebration replaced private suspicion. Music, offerings, and collective emotion redirected attention outward. The city was taught to associate obedience with prosperity and silence with safety. When crops grew or enemies retreated, it confirmed the narrative that the temple's methods worked. Economic dependence sealed the arrangement. Temples controlled food storage, labor assignments, and trade privileges. Families with members tied to the cult benefited materially. Challenging the institution threatened livelihoods. Silence became rational. Complicity became survival. Over time, moral discomfort was reframed as personal weakness. Witnesses were neutralized through fragmentation. No single person saw the entire process. One guard escorted, another confined. A scribe recorded symbols without context. A laborer cleaned chambers after the fact. A responsibility dissolved across roles. Each participant knew only a piece, and that piece could be justified as duty. For the women who survived and were released, the silence continued. They returned marked, physically and psychologically altered, but without permission to speak. Their presence was a warning. Their stories, if shared, would invite renewed accusation. Trauma became private, invisible, and therefore manageable for the city's conscience. What emerged was a culture where disappearance required no explanation. The absence of women became normal. Memory thinned. Names faded. And the temple stood intact, protected not only by walls and guards, but by collective avoidance. This machinery of silence is perhaps the most enduring violence of all. It ensured that cruelty did not need constant repetition to remain effective. The fear of becoming the next offender was enough. What happens when punishment reaches a point where even silence is no longer enough? Inside Baal's temple system, there was a final threshold reserved for those deemed beyond correction. At this stage, the goal was no longer submission or erasure of identity. It was total removal, not death as spectacle, but disappearance as doctrine. Executions were rarely public and almost never acknowledged. They took place in peripheral zones of the sacred complex, areas technically consecrated but rarely accessed by the general clergy. These spaces allowed the temple to act while maintaining plausible denial. A woman did not die. She was absorbed by the will of the god. Her absence was framed as transcendence, punishment, or necessary sacrifice, depending on the audience. Methods were chosen for discretion. Physical weakness from prolonged deprivation ensured that resistance was minimal. Death could come through exposure, controlled suffocation, ritual bleeding, or abandonment in sealed chambers. Each method left little evidence and required no explanation beyond divine necessity. The body, when recovered at all, was handled by trusted functionaries who understood that record-keeping ended here. Burial practices reinforced disappearance. Some women were interred in unmarked graves within temple grounds, their existence folded into the architecture of worship itself. Others were disposed of outside city boundaries, denying families any place of mourning. Without a body, grief had no anchor. Without a grave, memory dissolved faster. The language surrounding these acts was deliberately ambiguous. Phrases like returned to Baal, removed from the immortal order, or completed the cycle circulated quietly. These terms neutralized emotional response and discouraged further inquiry. To insist on clarity was to challenge sacred authority, a risk few were willing to take. This system of disappearance served a powerful function. It eliminated threats while preserving the illusion of divine order. No scandal emerged, no public reckoning occurred. The city remained stable, fear remained effective, and the institution remained untouchable. For those who witnessed fragments of these endings, the The psychological toll was profound. Knowing that disappearance could be permanent altered behavior more effectively than any public punishment ever could. Survival depended on invisibility, obedience, and silence. And so, women did not simply die inside Baal's temple. They ceased to exist in the eyes of the city. Their removal was not an accident of history, but a calculated outcome of sacred power unchecked. What happens to a woman who survives, a system designed to erase her? Survival inside Baal's temple did not mean freedom. For those who were released rather than executed, life afterward unfolded under a different kind of sentence, one that extended beyond walls, rituals, and guards into every interaction that followed. These women emerged altered. Prolonged isolation, deprivation, and ritualized violence fractured memory and identity. Modern language would call it trauma, dissociation, and learned compliance. In the ancient city, it was interpreted as humility restored, silence was praised, emotional flatness was taken as proof that purification had worked. Any attempt to speak about what happened risked reclassification as impurity returning. Reintegration was carefully controlled. Survivors were barred from certain spaces, rituals, and social roles. They were watched, their movements noted. Former networks of support had dissolved during confinement. Friends avoided them out of fear. Family members measured every word. The woman herself learned to monitor her thoughts, expressions, and posture, knowing that attention was dangerous. The body carried the aftermath. Chronic pain, weakness, tremors, and disrupted sleep were common. Yet these symptoms had no language. Suffering without a narrative becomes invisible. The city saw a compliant figure and called it success. The temple saw obedience and called it redemption. No one asked what it cost. Psychologically, the most enduring damage was uncertainty. The rules that condemned them had never been clear, so safety could never be guaranteed. This produced constant vigilance. The survivor learned to anticipate accusation before it formed, to reduce presence, to erase desire. Spiritual devotion became detached from belief and tied instead to survival. Some women attempted to rebuild meaning through private practices, small acts of care, or discreet solidarity with others who had endured similar fates. These connections were fragile and unspoken. There were no shared stories, only shared recognition. A glance held longer than normal, a silence that acknowledged understanding without risk. The city benefited from these survivors. Their visible submission reinforced fear more effectively than public punishment ever could. Everyone could see what happened to those who crossed invisible lines, and what it took to be allowed back among the living. Survival itself became a warning. This is how the system ensured longevity, not only by removing dissent, but by returning broken witnesses who could not testify. The temple did not need to kill everyone. It needed to make speaking impossible. Is it coincidence when different civilizations, separated by geography and centuries, follow the same script of persecution? What happened inside Baal's temple was not an isolated anomaly. When examined alongside other ancient cults and religious institutions, a disturbing pattern emerges, one that reveals how sacred authority repeatedly weaponized belief to control women. Across the Levant, the Mediterranean, and parts of Mesopotamia, similar mechanisms appear. Women in religious roles were elevated when useful and destroyed when threatening. Priestesses, oracles, healers, and ritual leaders were granted symbolic power, but never autonomous authority. The moment their influence extended beyond what male hierarchies could manage, accusations followed. Impurity, blasphemy, betrayal. The language changed, but the outcome remained the same. These systems relied on ambiguity. Sacred laws were intentionally flexible, allowing leaders to reinterpret divine will as circumstances demanded. This ensured that no woman could ever fully comply. Devotion became a trap. The more visible her role, the greater the risk she posed. Visibility attracted reverence. Reverence attracted suspicion. Suspicion justified punishment. What makes this repetition especially chilling is its efficiency. Once established, the model required little innovation. Accusation, isolation, ritualized suffering, erasure, silence. Each step reinforced the next. Each generation inherited the fear without needing to witness its origin. Abuse became tradition. Violence became normalized through repetition. Even the tools were similar. Secret tribunals, inner chambers, ritual language masking coercion, administrative disappearance. Survivors returned broken, serving as living warnings. Cities learned not to ask. Communities learned to comply. religion absorbed the cost and redistributed the fear. This pattern exposes a fundamental truth. The violence was not demanded by gods. It was engineered by humans protecting power structures threatened by female autonomy. Spiritual narratives provided justification, but the motivation was political, social, and psychological. Control over women's bodies and voices ensured control over belief itself. Recognizing these patterns matters because they dismantle the illusion of exception. Baal's temple was not uniquely cruel. It was representative. When sacred authority operates without accountability, it gravitates toward the same outcomes, regardless of culture or era. And this realization leads to the most uncomfortable question of all. If these patterns were so widespread, who benefited from their continuation, and who ensured they were preserved in silence rather than condemned in history? If the violence followed a pattern, then someone benefited from it. The final layer of Baal's temple system forces a question ancient records consistently sidestepped. Who gained stability, wealth, and authority from the destruction of sacred women? And why was this truth buried so effectively? Persecution redistributed power. Each woman removed from spiritual influence created a vacuum filled by male intermediaries. Ritual authority consolidated upward. Control over offerings, interpretations, calendars, and divine access narrowed into fewer hands. The temple became indispensable not because it connected people to the god, but because it monopolized meaning itself. Fear made obedience efficient. Silence made dissent impossible. Economically, the benefits were tangible. Temples governed land, labor, and surplus. By eliminating women who commanded devotion or loyalty, the institution reduced competition within its own hierarchy. Spiritual charisma outside official channels was dangerous. It threatened predictability. The safest solution was eradication framed as necessity. Politically, persecution stabilized alliances between clergy and civic leaders. When religion justified punishment, governance avoided responsibility. When governance protected the temple, religious authority remained unchallenged. The city prospered on the surface, while violence was absorbed into sacred routine. Order was preserved. Accountability vanished. This is why manuscripts are evasive. Records that survive emphasize offerings, victories, rituals, and divine favor. Absence is explained as transcendence. Death is ritualized into metaphor. Names disappear. Details blur. History becomes selective memory curated by those who won. What remains are fragments, administrative gaps, altered lists, sudden transfers, unexplained disappearances. When read critically, these silences speak loudly. They reveal an institution skilled not only at punishment, but at narrative control. Erasure was not a failure of record-keeping. It was the final act of violence. Understanding this matters because it reframes ancient cruelty as intentional design, not cultural accident. It forces us to confront how easily belief can be engineered into a tool of domination, and how long such systems can endure when protected by reverence and fear. The horror the city tried to hide was not just what happened to these women. It was the knowledge that the system worked, and that many depended on it continuing to work. If you stayed until this moment, you now understand why these stories were buried. What happened inside Baal's temple was not an exception, and it was not accidental. Remembering it matters because silence is what allowed it to survive for centuries. Subscribe to the channel if you want more historical narratives that expose what power tried to erase. Leave a like so this story reaches others who are searching for the truth behind sacred myths. And leave a comment writing exactly, "I saw what they tried to hide," to mark that you reached the end and refused to look away. Now watch the next video appearing on your screen, where another hidden chapter of ancient history is uncovered.